The routine was comfortable, if not uninspiring. Lydia's days followed a rhythm she could set her watch to. Early mornings with the hum of her coffee maker, afternoons spent managing her boutique flower shop, and evenings in solitude with a book or an old movie. At 52, she had made peace with the quiet of her life, the noise of her youth, a marriage that ended in polite but necessary divorce, children grown and scattered, had faded into a stillness she thought she'd embraced. Until one Thursday morning, the stillness shifted. The grocery store was its usual humdrum self, always bustling with shoppers. Lydia wandered through the produce section, carefully selecting oranges and apples with the precision of someone who had no need to rush. She was reaching for a bag of spinach when her fingers brushed against someone else's. "Oh, sorry," a voice said, warm and deep. Lydia turned, her eyes meeting his. He couldn't have been older than 30, with sun-kissed brown hair and an easy smile that seemed to light the fluorescent-lit aisle. No, it's fine," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of surprise. He chuckled, holding up his hands. Didn't mean to cause a spinach standoff. It was a silly comment, but Lydia found herself smiling, a real, unguarded smile. "Consider it resolved," she said, letting him take the bag. She expected the moment to end there, as these small exchanges often do. But it didn't. "Do you cook?" he asked, his tone casual, though his curiosity seemed genuine. "Sometimes," Lydia replied. "Mostly simple things." "Why?" "Just wondering if you had any tips. I'm trying to eat healthier, but I'm not exactly a wizard in the kitchen." There was something disarming about him, about his openness, the lack of pretension in his words. They chatted for a few minutes about recipes and cooking disasters before he introduced himself. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Lydia." "Well, Lydia, thanks for the spinach tips. Maybe I'll see you around," he said, giving her a parting smile before heading toward the checkout. The encounter was brief, almost inconsequential. But as Lydia returned home and unpacked her groceries, she found herself replaying it in her mind. There was a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. For the first time in a long while, her routine didn't feel quite so predictable. The next time Lydia saw Daniel was a week later, back in the grocery store. She was browsing the bakery section when his voice greeted her from behind. "Let me guess, you're here to critique my spinach recipes." Lydia turned, surprised to find herself smiling so easily. "Only if you've cooked them yet." He laughed, guilty as charged. "The spinach is still sitting in my fridge. But hey, I've been meaning to get back into cooking." Their conversation spilled over from the bakery into the coffee aisle, then the frozen food section. They talked about everything and nothing. His job as a physical therapist, her flower shop, their mutual love for classic movies. By the time they reached the checkout, Lydia felt lighter, as if the weight of her solitude had briefly lifted. It became a pattern. Their meetings at the store weren't planned, but they happened often enough to feel serendipitous. Each time, Daniel's easy demeanor drew Lydia out of her shell, and she found herself looking forward to their chats. One day, Daniel surprised her with a question. "Do you drink coffee? There's a place near here that makes a great cappuccino." It caught her off guard. She hadn't been asked out for coffee in years. Her first instinct was to politely decline, but the hopeful sincerity in his eyes gave her pause. "I do drink coffee," she said cautiously. "And I'd love to try this place you're so fond of." The cafe was cozy, tucked away on a quiet street. They sat by the window, sunlight streaming through, and talked for hours. Lydia learned more about him. His love for hiking, his fondness for his two nieces, his dream of opening his own clinic someday. In turn, she shared pieces of herself she hadn't spoken about in years. Her love for gardening, her recent struggle with loneliness, her bittersweet memories of raising her children. Daniel listened intently, his gaze never straying, his attention making her feel seen in a way she hadn't realized she missed. Their connection deepened with each conversation. It wasn't just his youthful energy that charmed her. It was his thoughtfulness, his ability to find joy in the small things, and the way he treated her words as though they mattered. And slowly, imperceptibly, the days began to feel brighter. Lydia found herself humming as she arranged flowers in her shop, smiling at the thought of their next encounter. She wasn't sure what this was, friendship, perhaps, or simply the comfort of companionship. But whatever it was changing her, filling her world with a warmth she hadn't known she still craved. It was a small moment that changed everything, a moment Lydia hadn't seen coming. She and Daniel were sitting on a bench in the park near the cafe, sipping their takeaway coffees and watching a pair of dogs chase each other across the grass. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in gold, and the air carried the crisp scent of autumn. Daniel was recounting a hiking trip he'd taken last summer, his face animated as he described nearly losing his footing on a narrow trail. Lydia laughed, shaking her head at his reckless enthusiasm. "You're fearless," she said. "Or maybe just a little reckless." "Maybe both," he admitted with a grin. "But life's too short to play it safe all the time, don't you think?" The question lingered in the air, striking a chord she wasn't prepared for. Lydia glanced at him, and for the first time, really noticed the way the sunlight caught in his hair, the easy confidence in his posture, the warmth in his smile. It hit her then, a quiet but undeniable realization. This wasn't just friendship. Her heart fluttered, an unfamiliar sensation she hadn't felt in years, and it startled her. She looked away quickly, her gaze fixed on the dogs, but her mind raced. "No, this isn't happening. He's so young. He probably doesn't even think of me that way." But the feeling didn't disappear. It lingered, wrapping itself around her thoughts. She saw him differently now. The way his laughter lit up his face, the way he genuinely listened when she spoke, the way he made her feel like she mattered. Her rational mind tried to dismiss it. He was in his early 30s, a man with his whole life ahead of him, and she was 52, with a lifetime of experiences behind her. The very idea was absurd, and yet there it was. Later that evening, as she stood in her kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, Lydia found herself replaying the moment in the park. She tried to convince herself it was a fleeting crush, nothing more. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was different. It wasn't just his charm or his kindness. It was the way he made her feel. Alive, vibrant, as though the years that had settled over her like a heavy blanket had suddenly been lifted. But with that realization came a surge of doubt. Could she allow herself to feel this way? Would it ruin the friendship they'd built? And even if he did feel the same, what would people think? She paused, the knife still in her hand, and took a deep breath. Her heart was pulling her in one direction, but her mind was full of questions she wasn't ready to answer. For now, all she could do was hold the feeling quietly, unsure of what to do with it but unable to let it go. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions Lydia couldn't quite sort through. Every time she saw Daniel, her heart betrayed her by skipping a beat. Even as her mind shouted warnings she wasn't ready to heed. They still met often, at the cafe, during casual strolls, or occasionally at her flower shop when he'd stop by to brighten his place up. Each interaction felt like a tug-of-war between joy and unease. She'd catch herself wondering if he noticed her lingering glances, or the way her laughter sounded too eager when he joked. Did he sense the shift in her feelings? And if he did, what would he think of her? One particularly restless night, Lydia found herself staring at the ceiling, her mind a storm of doubt. What am I doing? This isn't me. She prided herself on being practical, grounded, someone who didn't entertain reckless fantasies. But was it reckless to feel drawn to someone who made her happier than she'd been in years? The fear of judgment gnawed at her. She could hear the whispers in her mind, the disapproval from people who wouldn't understand. She's old enough to be his mother. What could he possibly see in her? And yet, there were moments when she allowed herself to imagine. What if he felt the same? What if she didn't have to face the rest of her life feeling invisible and alone? One day they met at the park again. Daniel had brought coffee as usual, and they sat under a sprawling oak tree, the leaves above them painted in the warm hues of autumn. "So," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "tell me something you've always wanted to do, but never have." The question caught her off guard. Lydia hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't reveal too much. "I don't know. Travel more, maybe. See places I've only read about." He leaned back, his hands resting behind him. "What's stopping you?" She smiled faintly. "Life. Responsibilities. And now, I suppose I've convinced myself it's too late." Daniel's expression softened. "It's never too late, Lydia. You're not as stuck as you think you are." His words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to believe him, to let his optimism replace her doubts. but the years of second-guessing herself were hard to silence. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and wondered if he could see the internal battle waging behind her composed exterior. Could she risk breaking her own rules? Could she allow herself to dream of a connection that felt impossible, no matter how real it seemed in her heart? That night, as she stood in her shop rearranging a bouquet of roses, Lydia caught her reflection in the glass door. For a moment, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. She didn't look tired or resigned. There was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or the faintest hint of courage. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but for the first time, she allowed herself to consider that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to find out. It started with a simple idea, one that blossomed in the quiet of her evening routine. Lydia had been tending to her modest garden, snipping herbs and deadheading flowers, when the thought struck her. Why not invite him over? The idea wasn't entirely selfless. She told herself it was about gratitude. For his kindness, for the way he'd brought light back into her days. A home-cooked meal felt like a reasonable gesture. And yet, beneath the surface, a deeper motive stirred, one she wasn't ready to admit even to herself. The thought filled her with both excitement and dread. Would it feel too intimate, too personal? Would he see through her carefully constructed reasoning and sense the emotions she'd worked so hard to suppress? The next time they met at the cafe, she broached the subject. "I was thinking," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor, "you've been so wonderful lately, always bringing coffee and good company. Let me return the favor. How about dinner at my place this weekend?" Daniel looked up from his cup, surprised but pleased. "Dinner? That sounds great. I'd love to." His easy acceptance left her breathless for a moment, and she quickly nodded to mask the wave of nerves that swept over her. "Wonderful. Saturday, then." "Saturday it is," he replied with a warm smile. The days leading up to the dinner were a blur of preparation and second-guessing. Lydia fussed over the menu, finally settling on roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, paired with a vegetable medley and freshly baked bread. A simple but elegant meal, something that felt both special and safe. She spent Saturday morning cleaning her modest home, making sure everything was in order. It had been years since she'd entertained anyone beyond family, and the act of setting the table with her finest dishes felt strangely intimate. By late afternoon, the house was filled with the rich aroma of roasting chicken and the faint, floral scent of the candles she'd placed strategically around the living room. She changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple navy dress that she hoped conveyed casual elegance. When the doorbell rang, her heart leaped. She took a steadying breath and opened the door to find Daniel standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of sunflowers in the other. "For you," he said, holding out the flowers. "Thank you," Lydia replied, her voice softer than she intended. "Come in." As he stepped inside, she felt an odd mix of pride and vulnerability. Her home, her sanctuary, was now his space, if only for the evening. They settled into an easy rhythm as the evening unfolded. Over dinner, their conversation meandered from light-hearted banter to more personal topics. Daniel shared stories from his childhood, while Lydia recounted moments from her youth she hadn't thought about in years. There were moments when their eyes met across the table, the silence stretching just long enough to feel charged with something unspoken. Lydia's pulse quickened each time, but she pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the laughter and warmth that filled the room. As the night wound down, they moved to the living room, sipping wine on the couch as soft music played in the background. For the first time in years, Lydia felt the weight of her solitude lift, and as Daniel leaned back, his gaze lingering on her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, she began to wonder if this moment was the start of something she'd never dared to hope for. The night had settled into a quiet rhythm, one that felt both familiar and electric. The candles flickered on the table beside them, casting soft shadows across Daniel's face. He leaned back against the cushions, sipping his wine, his eyes never leaving hers. Lydia could feel the heat between them, simmering just beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniable. She was painfully aware of the distance between them, even though it felt smaller than it had before. The small space on the couch that had once felt like a comfortable gap now seemed to hum with possibility. Lydia swallowed nervously, her heart beating just a little faster. Do you ever think about what life might look like if you didn't follow all the rules? Daniel asked, his voice low, as if testing the waters of something deeper. Lydia chuckled, though her laugh felt tight in her chest. What do you mean? You know, he said, his eyes holding hers with a kind of intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. If you took more risks, if you let yourself, he paused, seeming to hesitate, before finishing quietly, if you let yourself be more free. The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Lydia wasn't sure how to answer. She had spent so many years being the responsible one, the careful one. Her life, her choices, everything had been about keeping things steady, predictable, safe. She'd never allowed herself to consider the kind of freedom he spoke of, the kind that required surrender. But now, in this small, intimate space with Daniel, everything felt different. She felt the pull of something she had buried for so long, a yearning for something more, something that defied all her careful rules. She swallowed again, her voice almost a whisper. I think about it sometimes, what it would feel like to let go, to not worry so much. Daniel smiled softly, as if pleased with her honesty. You know, I think you'd be great at it, at letting go. The warmth of his words, his unwavering gaze, sent a rush of heat through her. Her pulse quickened as she realized, with startling clarity, that this wasn't just a conversation. This wasn't about the small talk they'd shared earlier. It was about something else, something neither of them had named yet but both had come to feel. The moment stretched out, a fragile thread between them. He leaned just slightly closer, and Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, feel the weight of his presence in the space between them. It was the kind of silence that felt charged, expectant. For a heartbeat, Lydia allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if she closed that last little bit of distance. If she let herself cross the line she had so carefully constructed. And then, without thinking, she did. Slowly, she leaned forward, her hands trembling as she placed them gently on his chest. Daniel didn't pull away. Instead, he met her halfway, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was soft at first, hesitant, as if they were both testing the waters of something new. But then it deepened, a quiet, unspoken promise that made Lydia's heart race. She felt the years of solitude, of self-imposed limitations, start to crumble around her. It was as if in that kiss, she had found the courage to be something more, something freer. When they finally pulled away, Lydia's breath came in shallow gasps. She looked into Daniel's eyes, seeing something there that mirrored her own confusion and hope. I didn't expect this, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Neither did I, he replied, his hand gently cupping her cheek. But I'm glad it happened. Lydia smiled, feeling the weight of all her doubts lift, just for a moment. In that instant, she didn't care about the judgments or the rules or the age between them. All that mattered was the connection they had found in each other, a connection that had been quietly growing between them all along. Lydia sat in the quiet aftermath of their kiss, the sound of their soft breaths filling the room. The candlelight flickered in the dim space, casting long shadows on the walls, but her focus wasn't on the room anymore, it was on him. On the way his fingers still lingered on her cheek, his eyes still soft with the same tenderness that had drawn her in so many weeks ago. She had never imagined she would find herself here, not in this moment, not with him. But now, sitting so close to Daniel, the years of her life, her carefully controlled, predictable existence seemed to blur. The age gap, the years she had spent alone, seemed irrelevant in the face of what she felt. He had awakened something in her she thought was lost to time, a desire to feel more, to let go of the constraints she had clung to for so long. As he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, Lydia realized how much she had been holding back, not just from him, but from herself. From her own heart, her own desires. In the span of a few weeks, Daniel had cracked open the parts of her she thought were buried, safely forgotten in the rush of her daily life. I've spent so many years thinking I had everything figured out, Lydia said softly, her voice shaky as she searched for the right words. Thinking I knew who I was, what I was supposed to be. But now I feel like I've been living in the shadows of my own life. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just held her gaze, the weight of his silent understanding filling the space between them. There was no judgment in his eyes, no confusion. Just a quiet acceptance. Lydia shifted slightly, turning her body toward him. I spent so much time being the mature one, the one who followed all the rules. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to dream. How to feel things like this? She reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed his. Daniel squeezed her hand gently, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. I never saw you as someone who followed the rules, he said, his voice low, his eyes never leaving hers. You're more than that. You've always been more than that. His words were like a balm to her soul, soothing the doubts and fears she hadn't realized she still carried. It was true. For so long, she had defined herself by the walls she had built around her, a fortress of routines of safety. But now, sitting here with Daniel, she felt as though she was slowly shedding those walls, piece by piece. I've spent so much time thinking that love is something that belongs to the young, to those who have the luxury of time, Lydia said, her voice faltering. But now I see that love doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't matter how old we are. It's always there, waiting for us to be ready for it. Daniel's thumb gently traced the back of her hand, his expression tender but serious. You were ready long before I came along, he said. You just needed to believe it yourself. Lydia smiled, her heart full, and for the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly understood. The years between them, the weight of her own self-imposed limitations, seemed insignificant in the face of what they shared. She knew it wouldn't be easy. They would face challenges, questions from others, judgments about their age difference. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the truth they had found together. That love wasn't confined to a certain time in life. It wasn't bound by age or society's expectations. It was simply a force that, when allowed, could weave itself into your life at any moment. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her. The room was still, the only sound the gentle hum of their breathing. But in that quiet moment, Lydia knew she had found something worth holding on to, something that had waited patiently for her, even when she hadn't been ready. And for the first time in years, she felt hope stir inside her. A hope that love could grow, no matter the stage of life. A hope that she wasn't too old for a new beginning. Lydia sat in the morning light, a cup of tea warming her hands, and looked out the window at the quiet street below. The world outside had not changed. The trees still stood. The birds still sang their familiar songs. But something within her had shifted. Something deep and transformative. She had spent so many years thinking that her story was already written, that the best parts of her life had already come and gone. The years of romance, of adventure, of passion and dreams. They were the stuff of her youth, lost in the past. But Daniel had proven her wrong. She had learned in these brief, intense weeks that love did not belong only to the young, to the ones who had decades of time ahead of them. Love was not a story defined by age. It was an energy, a force, a choice that could be made at any moment, regardless of how many years had passed. And so, she had chosen to embrace it, to allow it to be a part of her life in all its messiness, all its uncertainty. Lydia thought of the conversations they had shared, the laughter, the way Daniel made her feel seen. She thought of how he respected her, how he never once made her feel diminished because of her age, but instead cherished the depth of experience that came with it. And in return, she had come to treasure the way he approached the world, boldly, without fear, always seeking something more. He had reminded her of the parts of herself she had long forgotten, the curiosity, the excitement, the willingness to take a leap of faith. It hadn't always been easy, but as she thought back on their time together, Lydia realized that love, in all its forms, was always about risk. The vulnerability, the openness, the willingness to take a step into the unknown with someone else. Daniel had shown her that the act of loving was not reserved for the young, but for anyone willing to embrace it, at any stage in life. She smiled softly, her heart swelling with affection. Love had come to her when she least expected it, when she thought she was too old for it. And yet, here she was, full of life, full of love, ready for whatever would come next. Lydia set her cup down on the table, and as she gazed out at the world outside, she whispered softly to herself, love doesn't have an expiration date. It's always there, waiting to be discovered. And she was ready to follow her heart, wherever it would take her.